The way Julian always tossed his keys onto the imported Italian marble console, assuming the world would always be his to command, was exactly the moment the seismic shift began within me. It wasn't the misplaced trust or the shattered vows that broke me. It was the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his carelessness. He thought I was soft, perhaps a little naive, a brilliant architect, yes, but ultimately just the loyal wife managing the aesthetics while he managed the real money. Truth, the cold, heavy realization that dropped into my consciousness like an anchor, was found not in a cheap lipstick stain or a frantic text message, but in a meticulously formatted spreadsheet titled Project Nightingale. Julian had accidentally left his laptop open, screen facing the ceiling, displaying a detailed projection for the financing of a new luxury condominium complex in Miami. I specialized in infrastructure and zoning requirements for high-end residential towers, so my eye immediately caught the discrepancy. There was a secret holding company, registered in Delaware, funneling nearly 20% of the project's seed capital into an account controlled solely by Julian, under the guise of consulting fees paid to an entity that, upon a quick search using my private database access, turned out to be a shell corporation operating out of the Cayman Islands, managed by his mistress's brother. It wasn't just cheating, it was financial restructuring for infidelity. It was insurance on his betrayal. Julian, the man who preached fiscal transparency and partnership, was building a private escape hatch, leveraging our shared capital to fund his future with someone else. I closed the laptop screen slowly, the click echoing in the otherwise silent loft apartment. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. Instead, a profound, terrifying calm settled over me. Julian walked in moments later, oblivious, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and cheap deceit. He kissed me on the cheek, asked if I had ordered the groceries for the weekend, and disappeared into the shower. In that moment, I realized the game had changed. This wasn't about tears or dramatic confrontations. This was a hostile takeover. This required precision, patience, and a coldness he never imagined I possessed. I wasn't just going to leave him, I was going to dismantle him. I walked over to my home office, powered up my own secure system, and opened a new encrypted file. First step was data replication. I needed everything: financial records, project timelines, legal documents, and every communication he had stored on every device. I wasn't just planning revenge, I was drawing up the blueprints for his complete and total ruin. And the first rule of my silent war was, he must never ever suspect I knew. His complacency was the single greatest asset in my arsenal, and I would protect it at all costs, acting the part of the devoted, slightly dull wife until the very last brick of his carefully constructed life crumbled to dust. The first week following the discovery was a masterclass in emotional subterfuge. I performed the role of the devoted wife with chilling perfection. I listened patiently as Julian detailed his stressful days, offering massages and pouring his favorite single malt scotch. All the while, beneath the surface of my domestic tranquility, I was executing Phase 2, comprehensive financial mapping. Our shared life was a complex tapestry of intermingled assets, but Julian, in his hubris, had always focused on the grand total, neglecting the meticulous details of ownership and jurisdiction. Our architectural firm, Ethelred Designs, was legally structured as a partnership, but Julian's initial investment, secured through a substantial loan from his family, gave him controlling interest in the operating capital, while my intellectual property, the designs, the proprietary software, the patents for sustainable materials, remained vaguely defined as partnership assets. This was his weakness. While he controlled the cash flow, I controlled the creative foundation, the actual value of the company. I engaged Sarah Vance, a legal genius known for her brutal efficiency in complex financial divorces, under the strictest veil of confidentiality. I met her in a generic business center 2 towns away, insisting on cash payments and burner phones for initial communication. Sarah's first advice was simple: gather proof of sole creation for every major design project we had ever undertaken. This required deep dives into email archives, historical timestamps on CAD files, and even old napkin sketches hidden away in storage, documents Julian, always focused on closing the next deal, had deemed irrelevant long ago. I spent nights archiving 10 years of my life's work, cross-referencing every detail with industry-standard definitions of intellectual property. Meanwhile, Julian began pushing for a significant investment in a high-risk venture, a massive waterfront development in Charleston. He was already emotionally committed to the project, seeing it as his legacy. I, the supportive wife, enthusiastically encouraged this venture, even subtly suggesting specific minor structural decisions that I knew, based on recent zoning changes I had secretly tracked, would eventually create massive legal and financial liability down the line, but which looked perfectly rational on paper right now. Julian ate it up, convinced I was merely indulging his genius. The further he dove into that financial quagmire, the more exposed his personal assets became, tethered to the rising tides of debt required for the Charleston deal. I monitored the Cayman Islands account, noticing small, steady withdrawals, funds being used to furnish a separate apartment, likely for the mistress. Every dollar he diverted for his betrayal was meticulously logged, not for emotional accounting but for judicial reckoning. This was no longer just about pain. It was about ensuring that when the dust settled, the only person left holding the bag of consequences would be Julian. The digital infrastructure of Julian's betrayal was surprisingly fragile, resting on a foundation of laziness. He relied on the illusion of security provided by complex passwords that were, in reality, variations of old high school sports heroes or the name of his first dog. This was Phase 3, the invisible invasion. Julian kept a clean phone for me and clients, and a small, prepaid burner phone he thought he kept hidden in the false bottom of his briefcase. But I didn't need the physical phone, I needed the cloud. Julian used a generic backup service for all his devices, linked to an email account he barely checked. Over several quiet evenings, while he was working late, a common euphemism for his clandestine rendezvous, I gained access to this archive. The volume of data was staggering. Hundreds of texts, shared photos, future plans, and sickeningly detailed declarations of love to Veronica. It wasn't the words that hurt, but the evidence of future planning that cemented my resolve. He was discussing selling our mountain retreat to finance Veronica's boutique startup, casually dismissing our history as baggage. I meticulously cloned the entire archive, creating multiple encrypted backups stored in geographically diverse locations, protected by layers of security that would make the Pentagon blush. Crucially, I began altering minor, non-critical settings on his financial management dashboards. Nothing obvious, just small tweaks to the notification settings for capital transfers and legal filings. For instance, I redirected alerts for minor compliance warnings from his primary email to a junk folder he never reviewed. I also subtly changed the default payout settings for some smaller rental properties Julian rarely looked at, generating passive income, to direct funds not into the joint account but into a newly established, totally anonymous holding trust one had created solely for the purpose of paying for legal fees and immediate liquid expenses post-divorce. These changes were imperceptible. The totals on his main summary screens remained the same, but the underlying mechanisms had been rerouted. I was engineering an automated financial leak, a drip, drip, drip of capital that would go unnoticed until he needed a large sum, forcing him to look under the hood. The beauty of this digital silent treatment was that it could never be traced back to me. If anyone ever looked, it would appear Julian had been negligent, clicking the wrong boxes or simply being too overwhelmed to manage his own systems. His arrogance was the perfect cover for my technical proficiency. Every keystroke was a strategic move on a high-stakes chessboard, ensuring that when the time came for the final checkmate, the king would be completely exposed, believing he still had all his protective rooks and pawns intact, only to discover they were all fighting for the opposing side. Phase 4 demanded leveraging my expertise against his blind spots. Julian viewed the world through the lens of a dealmaker. I viewed it as a structural engineer. While he focused on the handshake and the projected profit, I focused on the foundation and the potential collapse points. The Charleston waterfront project, his great legacy, became my primary target. Julian had relied heavily on projections that failed to factor in recent subtle changes to FEMA flood zone maps and historic preservation mandates, details I had deliberately brought to his attention months ago, only for him to dismiss them as architectural nonsense. Now I acted as the supportive partner, providing him with a detailed review of the environmental impact study. I didn't fabricate data. I merely highlighted specific obscure clauses related to mandatory mitigation efforts for protected coastal habitats and presented the corresponding projected cost overruns in a format so complex and buried in minutiae that Julian, who hated reading fine print, simply signed off on it, thinking he was approving boilerplate environmental data. These hidden clauses guaranteed that once construction was underway, Julian would face catastrophic delays and exponentially rising costs related to specialized foundation work and material sourcing, delays that would trigger massive penalty clauses in his financing agreements. Simultaneously, I addressed the issue of the firm's major institutional clients. Julian often boasted about the personal relationships he maintained, but those relationships were built on the stability and reputation of Ethelred Designs' innovative work, my work. I began a quiet campaign of deepening my personal and professional ties with our two most lucrative clients, the City Planning Commission and the private equity fund Argos. I scheduled private meetings with their respective heads, ostensibly to discuss project progress, but truly to subtly reinforce the value of my individual contribution. I shared preliminary designs for future bids, showcasing concepts that were entirely my intellectual property and not yet officially submitted under the firm's name. This wasn't professional sabotage yet, it was hedging. It ensured that when Julian's Charleston venture inevitably imploded, creating scandal and instability, these key clients would recognize that the true talent and reliability resided with me, Alara, not with the financial leadership that had steered the company into troubled waters. I was building a life raft of professional loyalty, carefully insulating myself from the coming disaster. Julian, increasingly distracted by Veronica and the high-stakes gamble of Charleston, never noticed my growing independence. He saw my work hours extending, my focused demeanor, and assumed I was just being the good architect supporting his empire. Every move I made was masked by the perfect veneer of professional diligence and spousal support, setting the stage for the dramatic yet silent professional severance. The depth of Julian's commitment to his dual life became frighteningly clear in Part 5. He stopped making excuses and simply started listing reasons why he couldn't be home. His alibis became lazier, his attention span at dinner shorter, and his impatience with the mundane details of our shared life, scheduling, maintenance, social obligations, increased exponentially. He was fully invested in his new narrative, seeing me and our marriage as the dull, necessary stage upon which his exciting new drama played out. It was painful to watch, not because I still loved him, but because I was watching a successful, intelligent man willfully sabotage his entire existence for something so cheap and transitory. He had started renting a small, high-end studio in the West Village, the funds for which were coming directly from the capital reserves I had flagged in the Cayman account. He even had the gall to use our shared credit card to purchase expensive, personalized gifts for Veronica, claiming the charges were for client appreciation. I didn't challenge him. I simply documented every single purchase, printing out the receipts, noting the specific vendor, and attaching a photograph I had quietly taken of the items in the West Village apartment during a stealth visit when Julian was out of town on a business trip, a trip I knew was a cover for a weekend with Veronica. The psychological burden of maintaining this flawless facade was immense. To smile, to nod, to ask about his day with genuine curiosity while simultaneously planning the tactical destruction of his entire professional identity required an emotional rigor I didn't know I possessed. I had to bury Alara, the woman who loved him, and replace her with Alara, the executor, the architect of cold reality. I learned to derive satisfaction not from confrontation, but from preparation. Every document secured, every contract reviewed, every minute detail cataloged was a point scored against his deceit. He thought he was free. He thought he was getting away with it. That confidence was the key to his ultimate downfall. I often wondered if the immediate, explosive confrontation that most betrayed partners choose was perhaps an easier route. To scream, to cry, to break things, it would have released the pressure. But that choice only benefits the betrayer by forcing a quick resolution and messy settlement. My silence was a weapon, forging time and space for my strategy to mature. It allowed Julian to dig himself deeper, increasing the penalty for his actions tenfold. Brings us to a profound, unsettling question that often plagues this type of calculated response. Is the cold execution of perfect justice, where emotion is entirely removed from the scales, a greater act of self-preservation or a greater corruption of the soul? For those who have faced betrayal and chosen silence over confrontation, where do you draw the line between revenge and simply ensuring your survival? Share your thoughts below, because sometimes the quietest move is the one that costs us the most. Meanwhile, I found a small silver signet ring in the cuff of Julian's jacket, bearing the initials. It was further confirmation of the depth of his plans, a quiet promise of a future I would obliterate. With Julian fully preoccupied, his days split between frantic calls about the Charleston project's ballooning budget and hushed late-night rendezvous, I moved swiftly into Phase 6, securing the Citadel. This was the moment of professional decoupling, ensuring that when the firm inevitably fractured, the valuable core remained solely mine. Julian, believing he controlled the finances, had overlooked the necessary legal steps to transfer true ownership of the firm's intellectual assets. Using the meticulously compiled evidence of my sole authorship over all major projects, the design files dated years before Julian's full financial involvement, the communication records with initial clients, and the patent filings I had always managed, I executed a series of legal maneuvers orchestrated by Sarah Vance. The complexity was such that Julian wouldn't notice the changes unless he initiated a deep third-party audit, which his current financial stress made impossible. We filed amendments to the company's operating agreement, redefining intellectual property to explicitly reside with the originating creative force, me, upon any dissolution of the partnership, while Julian retained only the tangible assets purchased through his capital investment, furniture, office space leases, and the outstanding debt associated with the failed ventures. In essence, Julian would be left with the shell of the firm and all the liabilities, while I walked away with the blueprint for its future success and the reputation needed to rebuild instantly. Timing was critical. Charleston project was now careening toward inevitable disaster. I received an anonymous tip, channeled through Sarah, detailing a pending lawsuit from an environmental group concerning the building site's impact on local wetlands. This lawsuit, based on the zoning flaws I had subtly highlighted months ago, was set to be filed within the next 3 weeks, guaranteeing a complete halt to construction and massive default penalties. Julian was panicking, but covering it up with aggression and defensiveness, barking orders at staff and insisting the financing was solid. I, ever the supportive partner, suggested refinancing a segment of our residential property portfolio to inject emergency capital into the Charleston project, ostensibly to provide Julian with a safety net. Julian, desperate, agreed instantly. This move was the most brilliant and devastating part of my plan. By agreeing to leverage our primary home, which was jointly owned, I forced the bank to conduct a full reassessment of our assets. During this process, Sarah filed documents that quietly transferred my half of the house equity into a separate shielded trust, using the excuse of complex estate planning for tax purposes. Julian signed the release forms without reading them, too focused on the emergency cash flow. He was pouring good money after bad, and in the process, signing away his rights to the single most valuable personal asset we owned, our home. He was building his new life on the corpse of his old one, and I was ensuring the corpse would take him down with it. The environmental lawsuit hit Julian like a Category 5 hurricane. It was public, aggressive, and perfectly timed to coincide with a major downturn in the real estate market. Phase 7, the collapse, was underway. The headlines were brutal. Ethelred Designs faces multi-million-dollar liability over wetlands negligence. The City Planning Commission, already nervous due to the professional groundwork I had laid, immediately put our major pending projects on hold, citing financial instability and ethical concerns. Julian was spiraling. He was forced to divert almost every liquid asset he possessed to fight the lawsuit and stave off foreclosure on the Charleston property. He needed the emergency capital from the refinancing immediately. When he called the bank, he discovered the massive shortfall. The bank representative politely explained that while the joint mortgage was intact, the equity transfer was complete, citing the documents Julian himself had signed. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes, quickly masked by rage directed at the bank, the lawyers, and the incompetent staff he blamed for the error. He never once looked at me with suspicion. I offered a calm suggestion: sell off some of his smaller, less liquid assets, the art collection, the vintage car, the small rental properties he managed. He resisted, clinging to the trappings of wealth, but the legal pressure was too great. He began selling them off piecemeal, pouring the proceeds into the bottomless pit of Charleston debt. What Julian didn't know was that I had already secured private, cash-only buyers for his most prized possessions, collectors I knew from the art world and discreet brokerages. These sales were quick and below market value, accelerating his financial hemorrhage. The funds from these sales, however, were not entirely going to his legal defense. A significant percentage was being skimmed off the top to cover the tax liabilities and penalties he was incurring, liabilities I had strategically failed to alert him to earlier via the redirection of his notification emails. He was bleeding cash and didn't know where the cuts were. The mistress, Veronica, sensing the shift from luxurious future to immediate crisis, began demanding explanations and expressing concern over his ability to provide for her. Julian, stressed and defensive, pulled back, creating distance that was necessary for my final steps. His pride was too high to admit failure to his lover, forcing him into isolation. Professional disaster was fully mature, and now the personal sphere was beginning to rot from the inside out, exactly as planned. With Julian isolated and financially paralyzed, Phase 8 commenced, the Great Extraction. I had meticulously handled the finances, but now I had to deal with the physical reality of our life. Our home, the beautiful modern space we had built together, was filled with high-value items, not just the art Julian sold, but priceless first-edition books, rare architectural sketches, and custom-designed furniture that represented my entire aesthetic vision. These items, though purchased jointly, were intrinsically linked to my career and identity. Over 2 consecutive weekends, while Julian was supposedly at meetings with his defense lawyers, I orchestrated a silent, methodical removal of these objects. I hired a specialized, highly insured moving company, instructing them to work only between midnight and 5 a.m., using unmarked vehicles and covering all identifying markers on the boxes. I supervised every detail, labeling boxes with coded references that only I understood, ensuring that the movers had no idea they were emptying the house of half its worth. I told the minimal household staff that Julian was storing some archives in preparation for the sale of the Charleston project. No one questioned the architect-wife moving blueprints. The items were placed in 3 separate high-security storage facilities under the trusts Sarah Vance had established. I replaced the high-value items with visually similar but significantly cheaper replicas, a skill I had learned from staging multi-million-dollar homes for clients. A certain Persian rug was swapped for a convincing imitation. An original sculpture was replaced with a gallery-quality cast. The difference was negligible to the casual observer, especially a distracted, stressed-out Julian. He was too consumed by the financial firestorm to notice the subtle changes in the texture of the carpet or the slight variation in the glaze of a vase. Emotionally, I was already gone. I packed 2 small suitcases for myself, containing only my essential clothes, my most important documents, and the original blueprints for every project I ever cared about. I prepared a final, detailed ledger of every asset I had secured, every dollar Julian had illegally diverted, and every piece of evidence of his infidelity. This was not a document of spite. It was a weapon of absolute truth, formatted with the cold, irrefutable clarity of a legal deposition. I secured temporary residence in a minimalist, fully furnished apartment I had leased months earlier under a pseudonym, paying 6 months in advance with the funds I had discreetly siphoned from the smaller rental properties. I was shedding my identity as Mrs. Julian Hayes and stepping into the identity of Alara, the sole proprietor. I waited until I knew Julian was scheduled for a particularly grueling deposition. Then I left the house, locking the door behind me for the last time. It was not a grand exit. It was a calculated retreat, the final move before the bomb dropped. The confrontation was not explosive, it was surgical. I chose the location deliberately, Julian's temporary office in a sterile temporary co-working space, a far cry from the opulent corner office he was currently locked out of due to unpaid rent on the firm's main headquarters. I arrived precisely at 2 p.m., carrying a single, heavy, leather-bound binder. Julian, haggard and aged 10 years by the stress of the lawsuits, looked up, surprised. He assumed I was there to offer comfort or discuss the mortgage payments. I offered neither. I sat opposite him at the cheap conference table and pushed the binder forward. "This is everything, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, completely level. "Everything you need to know about the next phase of your life." He frowned, opening the binder dismissively. The first tab was a printed, time-stamped log of every message, photograph, and communication with Veronica, dating back 18 months. He blanched, the color draining from his face as he realized the depth of his exposure. "How?" he stammered, his eyes darting. "Irrelevant," I cut him off, folding my hands neatly on the table. "The how is simple negligence on your part. You assumed I was stupid." He flipped the page, moving past the emotional evidence and straight into the financial section. Tab 2, the full forensic accounting of Project Nightingale, detailing the diversion of joint capital into the Cayman accounts for Veronica's benefit. Tab 3, the legal documentation signed by him, showing the equity transfer of our primary residence entirely into my shielded trust. Tab 4, the amended operating agreement for Ethelred Designs, proving that upon dissolution, all intellectual property, clients, and future revenue streams legally belong to me, leaving him with only the corporate debt and the failed Charleston liability. Julian finally looked up, his face a mask of dawning horror. "The firm, the house, you can't have done this. We're partners." I opened the final section, a copy of the divorce petition. "We were partners. You dissolved that partnership the moment you chose Project Nightingale over me. You relied on my loyalty, Julian. I relied on the law." He frantically grabbed his phone to call his lawyer, but I stopped him with a single brutal sentence. "Your lawyer knows. Sarah Vance is my lawyer now. She filed the documents that sealed your fate. All of your retained staff has been offered positions at my new company, which will open next week, operating with all the clients you think are still on retainer." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Julian's frantic breathing. He realized the quiet months, my unflappable support, had not been submission, they had been preparation. He had been playing checkers while I was designing the chessboard he was standing on. The full scope of his loss dawned on Julian with terrifying speed, not in a single shocking instant, but in a relentless procession of realized failures. He was ruined financially, professionally, and personally. He tried the rage, slamming the binder shut, accusing me of cold-hearted manipulation. "You planned this. You watched me fail," he yelled, finally shattering the controlled silence. "Yes," I confirmed calmly, standing up. "I did. You planned to leave me destitute to fund your affair. I merely ensured that the consequences of your actions fell entirely upon you." I placed a final, small packet of documents on the table, the paperwork detailing the below-market sales of his art and car collection, and the tax liabilities he now owed on those transactions. The remaining capital is enough to cover the initial legal fees for the Charleston lawsuit, but nothing more. You have 30 days to vacate the co-working space. The lease on our home has been transferred fully to my name, effective immediately. If you attempt to challenge this, every piece of evidence regarding your financial fraud and marital deceit will be presented publicly during the divorce proceedings, ensuring that you not only lose your assets but your reputation as well. He staggered back, dialing Veronica's number with shaking hands. He pleaded with her, promising he would fix it, trying to maintain the illusion of control. I watched impassively as she answered, only to hear his voice crackle back through the cheap speaker, demanding to know where she was and why she wasn't responding to his messages. Veronica, having quickly researched the news headlines and sensed the shift in his solvency, had already decided her future did not include a bankrupt cheat-fighting environmental lawsuits. She had quietly changed her number and moved out of the West Village studio, leaving a short typed note for Julian that simply read, "Sorry, I can't do broke." He listened to her friend's polite, final denial, his shoulders collapsing. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and vacant, finally seeing the real cost of his arrogance. He had sacrificed everything: his stable career, his immaculate reputation, his multi-million-dollar portfolio, and the woman who held the literal blueprints to his success, for a few months of shallow infidelity. He realized with a sickening finality that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his entire foundation. He was standing on a barren plot of land, facing a massive, self-inflicted bill, and I, the woman he thought was merely decorative, was the one holding the deed to the entire surrounding territory. I paused at the door. "I wish you luck, Julian. You'll need it. I recommend you find a very good defense lawyer who specializes in bankruptcy." Then I walked out, leaving him alone in the sterile office, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, bound in the perfect, devastating silence of my final move. The realization that I had taken everything without ever raising my voice, without shedding a single tear in his presence, was the ultimate, shattering twist he would carry for the rest of his ruined existence. His final move had been to betray me. My final move was to erase him. He had lost the game before he even realized it had begun, and the truth of that defeat would haunt him more than any screamed accusation ever could. I simply vanished into the future I had designed for myself, rich, free, and utterly vindicated. This kind of silent revenge isn't about the pleasure of watching them suffer. It's about the profound satisfaction of reclaiming your power and designing a better life, free of their chaos. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Her Final Move and join us next time as we explore the terrifying precision of a betrayal answered with absolute calculation.